I'll pass the floor to Sean, who will speak for 25 to 30 minutes.
Oh, thanks, Light. Yeah, when Light says I'm going to speak more widely about austerity, he's absolutely correct. I'm going to spend most of my remarks on the situation in Greece, and in particular, as Matt has outlined, the meteoric rise of Syriza, the radical left coalition over there, in the elections about 10 days ago. And as Matt has also indicated, this is an absolutely crucial question for us to be looking at here in Britain, where the class struggle at its most developed point has thrown up a political alternative that is assuming a mass character, getting to the point of challenging for forming a government and taking state power, which is an absolutely very exciting development for socialists, trade unionist workers, and people not just in Europe but across the world as well. So the elections that took place 10 days ago in Greece were the second elections to take place in the space of 6 weeks. The elections that took place at the start of May, the vote was very fractured. No one party was able to muster enough support to form a government in May. Although in the May elections, as in the ones that we've just seen, Syriza finished a close second, and they finished an even closer second in the elections just gone. Just to put that in context, if anyone's not aware, in the elections 10 days ago, Syriza won 71 seats in a 300-seat parliament in Greece. They won 27% of the vote. Again, to put that in context, it's a different electoral system there. 35% of the vote is required in the PR system that they have in Greece to form an absolute majority, so not very far away from that. The party that won the elections, the Conservative equivalent, New Democracy, won with just 29% of the votes and 79 seats, so just a hair's breadth in it. But again, because of the perversity of the Greek system, the party that comes out with the highest percentage also gets a 50-seat top-up, which is able to push the New Democracy into a position to form a government, which they have done in Greece. Again, a lesson here for us here in Britain. The coalition that they've now formed in Greece is the equivalent of the Conservatives and New Labour forming a government together. The PASOK party, the Pan-Hellenic Socialist Movement in Greece, has gone into coalition with New Democracy and intend to work together to implement massive austerity. And I'll deal with some of those points in a moment. So the rise of Syriza in Greece for us really poses the turning of the working class to left, and more specifically even socialist ideas, and for us poses the firm question that is socialism back on the agenda? And we would say that yes, it is. Everything in the situation across Europe and indeed the world points to that. However, it's not back on the agenda in an uncomplicated way, as I'll go on to explain. But a bit of a sort of background and history to Syriza, again for the lessons that we can draw here. What really lies behind the meteoric rise of Syriza is that they were willing to say what nobody else was prepared to in Greece. They said no to austerity. They said no to the diktats of what's become known as the Troika in Greece, which is the European Union, the International Monetary Fund and the European Central Bank, all institutions of big business and capitalism. They said no to the Greek capitalist class, the German capitalist class, which are the main driving force behind the Troika at this time in Europe. And said no to world capitalism, which also has a vested interest in ensuring that the Eurozone crisis is resolved in favour of the bosses and not of the working class. So in saying no to all of these mighty forces and powers, a small new party, it's offered hope to millions across the world, to workers, poor, young people, and so on. And I think that's why we're here discussing it, thousands of miles away, 10 days later, because there are so many lessons and examples in it for us. To go back a bit, I mean, Syriza is a coalition of different left parties, very small left parties. The Greek left is notoriously fractured, more so than the British left, into a whole number of very small groups. One of them, one of the more sizable ones, is the Greek section of the Committee for Works International, which is our international affiliate. We meet regularly with these comrades and discuss with them. There's a meeting coming up, in fact, in a couple of weeks' time, where members of the Socialist Party in England and Wales will be meeting with our Greek members. But that's what Syriza essentially is. So it's not based on the trade unions or the organised working class. it's a new party. It was founded in 2004 for the elections that were taking place in Greece in that year. And in its first outing, it got 3.3% of the vote, which is around the sort of level that we're currently hitting in Britain. Although I think in the last elections that the trade unions and socialist coalition stood in, the average in the seats that we stood in was actually more like 5 to 6%. Although of course we didn't stand in every seat. So Syriza is an organisation that predates the world economic crisis, which brings certain complications to its development, which have a bearing on where it is now and where it's going. In 2007, its second electoral outing, Syriza achieved 5% of the vote, surprising many that they actually managed to do that well. But then in 2009, the next set of elections, which took place in a radically changed situation. They were the first elections in Greece since the world economic crisis developed, and I'll deal with that in more detail in a moment, but effectively in 2009 Greece was plunged, as was much of Europe, into a banking crisis. Government and EU state bailouts, the sovereign debt crisis was developing as a result of those bailouts and bank collapses. Greece was being put on life support by the capitalist powers to try and prevent the breakup of the Eurozone, situation that's still carrying on. But in effect, all of the efforts were an attempt to place the burden for the developing crisis onto the shoulders of the working class, which the method by doing that can be summarised really as nationalising the bank debts and putting them onto the Greek people as a whole, whilst leaving the profits of the banks and big business privatised, so that the rich continued to receive massive rewards, and that situation has continued. It's a feature in Britain and has continued today. Now, in an attempt to deal with this in 2007, the New Democracy government at the time began a massive programme of austerity, of cuts and attacks on the living standards of ordinary people. So you would think that in 2009 there would be exceptionally favourable conditions for the development of a radical alternative. But what actually happened in those elections was Syriza slipped back slightly from their 2007 position, not massively, but a bit, to 4.6% of the vote. And at the time, our members in Greece produced material to analyse this. And the Syriza effectively in 2009 failed to turn towards the mass movements that had begun to develop, or to engage the youth, which were also entering into mass struggle, occupations and so on, predating actually the development of the Occupy movement and so on. And so Syriza wasn't seen as central to the fight back that was developing, and slipped back a little bit. However, the Greek crisis continued through 2009 and 10. As a result of the 2009 elections, PASOK formed the government, picked up exactly where New Democracy left off and continued with massive austerity cuts. 2010 and 11 saw massive economic crisis, which I'll detail a bit more in a moment, mass struggle, which again I'll detail a bit more in a moment. And by November of last year, the crisis and strikes effectively brought down the government. Of course, that's not how it was reported in the news. It wasn't said that the struggle of the workers had brought down the government. But effectively, the pressure from below of the mass strikes and demonstrations that had taken place on the politicians excuse me, of the establishment parties meant that the government was unable to get enough votes to pass the next raft of austerity measures in return for the next bailout. As a result of that, the government resigned, and in a sort of collaboration of all the different parties, agreed that they would put in an unelected technocrat, Papadimos, a former banker at the European Central Bank and the Bank of Greece, to pass the austerity measures being demanded without any comeback, or so they thought, on the elected politicians of the established parties. So this was, in effect, was an attempt by the political class in Greece to buy a bit of breathing space for them to get their act together, whilst the cuts would still be made without them bearing direct responsibility, which, as the rise of Syriza has shown, has not really developed. As part of that coalition deal with putting in the caretaker government, elections were scheduled for early this year, pushed back several times. The German Foreign Ministry proposed to postpone them all the way till the autumn, so fearful were the establishment of Europe and of Greece that the Greek people would make the wrong choice and vote against austerity by electing a radical alternative. The elections were eventually held at the start of May, and Syriza quadrupled its vote from 2009, achieving 16.8% of the vote. What was most significant was that Syriza came second, pushed PASOK, the traditional party of the working class, into third place. And correctly, we would say, Syriza acted in the correct way following these elections, because when New Democracy, who came first, failed to form a coalition, the task in electoral law in Greece then fell to Syriza and their young leader Alexis Tsipras. And he correctly ruled out, and Syriza correctly ruled out, trying to form any sort of coalition with any pro-austerity parties in Greece, which is an important question. So, the left across Europe has fallen into this trap on a number of occasions. The RC in Italy went into coalition and effectively destroys itself by taking part in governments that implemented cuts. The Left Party in Germany has followed a similar strategy and undermined itself fatally in some areas of Germany, not uniformly, but that's something we don't have time to deal with really. But what Tsipras did and what Syriza did was appeal to the Communist Party and the Democratic Left and other left parties in Greece. As I said, it's a number of groups are organised in Syriza, but by no means the whole left are organised there, and appealed for a government of the left to be formed. Unfortunately, the Communist Party, with Stalinist heritage, rejected such a call outright, something that they may now regret as a result of that stand, because in the June elections, which we've already mentioned, Syriza has emerged decisively as the dominant force on the left, doubling its vote again in the space of 6 weeks to finish with the 27% that I've already mentioned. And I think that the rapid rise of Syriza, especially since 2009 when the crisis began to bite, is a crucial point for us here in Britain, because it shows how rapidly new formations can come together, the working class can turn to them, and they can even be thrust into power. Now there's a whole number of questions about Syriza not just being thrust to power by the working class, but involving and including the working class in its structures, in its struggle, the working class actually leading Syriza. But nonetheless, the rise of Syriza has represented a political earthquake in Greece and across Europe. And Greece, just to underline this point, has had its own version of the two-party system, the sort of system we've got in Britain, where the government flips back and forth between Labour and the Tories. And that's been a similar situation in Greece since the end of the Second World War between PASOK and New Democracy. Until the last two elections, combined, PASOK and New Democracy would get up to 85% of the vote. People would vote for one or the other, by and large. In the May elections, the combined vote of those two parties fell from 85% to 32%, as the old established political norms just shattered under the weight of the world economic crisis. Recovered slightly in the polarised election, which if I've got time I'll mention some more detail on in a moment, to around 40% of the combined vote. But it shows that nothing will ever be the same in Greece again. And again, when these movements begin to develop on a higher level in Britain, nothing will ever be the same here again, as the new political reality, new social and economic landscape begins to develop. But for us, really, the situation, the rise of Syriza, was not a total surprise to our forces in Greece or us here in Britain. The analysis that we've put forward has highlighted that it is implicit in the situation that these sorts of realignments are going to take place with the weight of the crisis that has been developing. And just to give a bit more detail of what we've seen in Greece over the past 2 to 3 years. Firstly, on the austerity, the huge austerity that has been imposed on the Greek people. There's been 3, 4 or more austerity packages, waves of austerity now in Greece. The collapse of the economy since the high of 2008, before the crisis developed, has been the largest of any developed capitalist country since the 1930s. 20% of the economic output of Greece has been wiped out. Public sector wages have been cut by more than 40%. Those that are still employed, because there's been massive layoffs in the public sector as well. The average wage in Greece has plummeted to €400 per month. And in a recent article by our Greek comrades, they, to give this a context, made the point that the price of a coffee in Athens or London is the same. So people are trying to get by with not massively less cost of, massively lower cost of living on, equivalent of about £350 a month. Whole families dependent on one wage, trying to spread around extended families and so on. It's estimated that 250,000 Greeks are being fed at soup kitchens run by churches and other voluntary organisations. As a result of cuts in the health service, more than half of the hospital beds have been closed down. There have been regular reports, I've noticed in The Guardian, for example, of the crisis of the Greek healthcare system. And unemployment, of course, is a massive issue as well, in particular for the youth, where more than half of young people are unable to find work. How long have I been speaking? 15 minutes. Which, for the next 5 minutes, I don't talk too much over time. Thanks. Just the other side of this, because I've spent a lot of time obviously dealing with the rise of the far left, but in the sort of situation of social breakdown that we're seeing in Greece, and again, a warning for us here in Britain. It's not just been the left that has gained as a result of the social crisis developing in Greece. It's the far right, the fascist Golden Dawn Party has also picked up support, nowhere near on the scale of Syriza, but they've managed to get MPs elected. They got to 7% of the votes. I suspect that most people here will have seen the sort of character of this organisation. It was on most of the news websites, the Greek talk show where a Golden Dawn MP was debating with a Communist Party and a Syriza MP, two women MPs, and losing the argument, he picks up his glass of water, throws it at the Syriza MP, and then attempts to start punching the Communist Party MP, just showing that this is a group of unreconstructed Nazi thugs, in effect, who, when they lose the argument, resort to their fists. There have been reports from Greece that they've become more militant, going onto the streets to try and push their agenda. Reports of Golden Dawn members stopping buses, boarding them, dragging off immigrants to beat them up. The threat during the 6-week election campaign between May and June of going into the hospitals and turning immigrants out of hospital beds. Anyone who didn't look like they were Greek or born in Greece or whatever arbitrary criteria they might have used to be thrown out of their hospital beds. Been attacks on gay bars, gay areas in Greece. This is obviously a very worrying development, one that we would say is almost inevitable in a situation of capitalist crisis, and that the left has an enormous responsibility to make sure that we offer a firm alternative to ensure that the far right do not rise any further and are pushed back. It goes without saying, of course, that they have no answers to the crisis of capitalism, unlike ourselves, which I'll get to shortly, I hope. Just to flesh out a bit more, the response to the Greek working class, which has been absolutely heroic and massive. It's not been the austerity over the last few years has not just been meekly accepted. At the last count, there have been 16 one-day general strikes in Greece, shutdowns of the entire organised workforce and beyond as well, with unorganised workers, small businesses as well, closing their shops. The last two strikes that took place at the end of 2011 are actually broadened down to 48-hour strikes, showing the depth of feeling and the willingness to struggle of the working class. There's been massive youth movements in Greece. The squares of all of the main towns have been occupied by young people last year. Universities have been in and out of occupation as cuts have been pushed through there. There's been massive demonstrations against austerity. The largest one in Athens, again at the end of last year, was 800,000 strong, which in a country with a population of, I think it's around 11 million, is an absolutely huge proportion of the population to be drawn into active struggle. There's been mass civil disobedience, the non-payment of road tolls, of public transport fares, that these have either been privatised or put up. There's been strike action outside of the general strikes of different groups of workers. In January, when I was at an international meeting of ours and discussed with some of the comrades from Greece, they told the story of the refuse workers' strike in Athens. I'm afraid I don't know the outcome of it, but it was still live in January. And if there's any group of workers that can go out that will be out on strike, that will be a test of public opinion, it's refuse workers. You know how to get whipped up here, your bins aren't collected, it's posed as some sort of anarchy in the streets, the trade unions holding the country to ransom and so on. But in Greece, when the Athens Municipal Authority tried to bring in a scab workforce to undercut the strike, and they went out and started collecting the bins, there was the comrades were reporting that many of the residents were going out onto the streets, chasing after the trucks, grabbing their bin bags back off them and dragging them back to their curb, saying that they refused to let these scabs break the strike, and that they would rather their rubbish went uncollected than undermine the struggle of the workers. I can't I don't have time to list all the other actions. There's been strikes in steel factories, journalists, occupations of the TV networks, hunger strikes by immigrants, electricity workers have refused to disconnect anyone who hasn't paid the increased bills. So a whole host of strikes and mass protests I don't have time to deal with. But nonetheless, say Greece has been absolutely convulsed by a class struggle in the recent period. Just to pull out and paint a bit of a wider picture. The crisis in Greece is not just a Greek problem. There is an attempt by the mainstream media to portray Greece as a unique case, that the Greeks are particularly lazy, or their economy is particularly uncompetitive, they've got too many protections, too much workers' rights, or whatever it is. But the reality is that Greece is a symptom of the worst crisis that world capitalism has faced since the Great Depression. The crisis in the Eurozone, the sovereign debt crisis as it's now known, is also just the latest phase in a crisis that is nearly 5 years old now. In fact, we would go back further than that and say that the roots of the world economic crisis developed in the 1970s, in particular the introduction of neoliberalism, the huge capital flows that were developing and unleashed by the liberalisation of financial markets and so on, the stoking of global imbalances, speculation, bubbles, in particular obviously the subprime bubble that developed in the United States. But the boom of the 1990s and 2000s, as a result of these underlying features, was a complete house of cards waiting to collapse. We warned that it would, and indeed it did, with the banking collapse that developed through 2007 and particularly in the autumn of 2008, epitomised of course by the collapse of Lehman Brothers in the United States, which had the domino effect which ricocheted around the world. As a result of that banking collapse, 2009 saw the first worldwide recession since the Second World War, as all of the major economies and even the developing ones went into recession. And in an attempt to save their system, the capitalist class introduced massive bailouts on an unprecedented scale of the banking system, introduced massive stimulus measures to try and keep the economy ticking over, partially learning the lessons of the 1930s, but not completely. And 3 years later, we'd say completely forgetting the lessons of the 1930s, as demand is absolutely destroyed by the imposition of austerity. These bailouts and stimuluses massively increased the national debt, which of different countries, as I said, the bank's debts were effectively nationalised and put onto the shoulders of ordinary working people. And this increase in debt spooked the markets, which is then what led to the latest phase, the sovereign debt crisis, which is most acute, of course, in the Eurozone, though by no means confined to the Eurozone, as the situation in Britain, of course, and the United States in particular, goes to show. One of the lines of propaganda from the capitalist class is that they don't start the story all the way back in 2008 or even earlier in the exhaustion of the post-war boom, as I just did, but they try and present it as if the public sector has been too big for too long, that it's unproductive, that public sector workers don't work high enough, that we've had it too good for too long and so on, and that cuts are necessary and inevitable, which is all just an attempt to try and disguise the contradictions and the failings of their system. So just a few quick remarks on where the Eurozone as a whole is at before I make some closing remarks on Britain. I mean, it's not automatic, such as the depth of the crisis, that Greece will be the trigger for the breakup of the Eurozone, which we still think in the Socialist Party and our International is the most likely perspective. The attention, economically at least, has switched to Spain in recent weeks. Massive banking crisis that is developing there, massive property bubble that was inflated that has popped, exposing the banks there. There's been another 100 billion euros has agreed to be put in to recapitalise the Spanish banking system, although, as most commentators, I've printed off articles here, would say, even the capitalist class don't actually expect this bailout of Spain. It's not technically a bailout, this giving money to the Spanish banks to actually prevent the crisis from developing further there. Italy as well has a stagnant economy, the debt is increasing. In that country as well, they've booted out the elected government. I mean, Berlusconi was no friend of the working class, but they've put in his place a completely unelected technocrat in a similar vein to what they did in Greece at the start of the year. There's no doubt that Ireland will require another bailout, most likely Portugal as well. And as austerity is imposed by the European Union and its institutions, by the German capitalist class, Europe is increasingly becoming ungovernable from the point of view of capitalism. It's not just Greece that has seen strikes and demonstrations, but Spain, all of Italy, all of southern Europe has been massive protests. In Eastern Europe even, a lot of countries outside the Eurozone, but there's austerity going through there, provoking a fight back. In Britain we've seen mass strikes at the end of last year, and constant low-level class struggle, different workplaces coming out. Not time to go through those, but maybe it can feature in discussion. But from the point of view of capitalism, they would present this as chaos. You know, the economy's in trouble, chaos is developing. But for us, this is the fight back of the working class. It's not chaos, it's the trade union movement, it's the working class, new organisations like Syriza being thrown up that are trying to struggle and grope their way to an alternative. I'll finish with just some remarks on Britain. I mean, we can go into in the discussion. I have noticed we can explore more why Syriza didn't win the election. There's a whole number of different points and nuances that our comrades in Greece have explained to us about the situation there. In terms of our position as well, of what we put forward on the alternative to austerity and the euro, which aren't uncomplicated questions. The need for a socialist programme, nationalisation of the banks, democratic economic planning, in the event of being forced out of the euro by the capitalist powers by refusing to implement austerity. The question of needing to bring in capital controls, freezing the assets of the super rich and the banks, under democratic working class control as a way to prevent a complete collapse. All of those points we can explore in the discussion. But just to finish then on Britain, because Greece really is a mirror for where Britain could be in the not too distant future. It's been reported that of all the cuts that the Conservative Liberal Democrat government are wishing to push through, only 15% of them have actually been, or thereabouts, have actually been implemented in. There's an element of Greece already in the living standards and vast swathes of ordinary people in Britain. Last week a report by The Guardian reported that up to 7 million people are just one bill away from being pushed into poverty, being unable to meet their rent or whatever bill it is that they might have to pay. And although Britain is not in the Eurozone, the bulk of British exports go to the Eurozone. A deep recession there or breakup of the Eurozone would massively impact the British economy, leading to layoffs across the private sector as the capitalist class try to protect their wealth. The banks in Britain are exposed massively to different sections of the Eurozone. There was one report I was looking at last week that said after, I think it was Italy, its British banks are most exposed to the Spanish banks, so a banking collapse there would provoke a banking collapse in Britain almost certainly as well, notwithstanding all of the attempts last week by Mervyn King and Cameron and Osborne to inject new funds and support into the UK banks, measures that won't go far enough by a long way. But it's not just the economic chaos and ruin that's going to come to Britain. Fortunately, you'll be glad to hear, but the fight back as well. It's already started in Britain. As I mentioned earlier, we saw massive strikes in the public sector at the end of last year and the start of this year. One-day strikes. Strikes that the right-wing leaderships of the UK trade unions didn't want to see happen, but again were compelled by the pressure of the activists and the ordinary members from below. The high point of which was, of course, November 30th, where up to 2 million workers were on strike. That dispute over the cutting of pensions particularly isn't finished yet, but it's clear that the big trade unions in particular, the leaderships have no willingness to continue that struggle, but it's going to end up being drawn into other disputes which are developing on pay and other issues. But it's not just in the public sector where the fight back has begun. In the private sector as well, as I mentioned earlier, I'm getting to the end of my remarks. I mean, just last week, for example, I attended protests by the Corrigan oil refinery workers, the attempt to close the oil refinery down in Essex. 850 jobs potentially lost. Workers have been protesting. We managed a 40-minute blockade of the oil terminal, which upset the police massively. There's a report in our paper of it. this week. But the struggle of the electricians across the country, in particular in London, different building sites against pay cuts, which was actually victorious. There's been struggles at the Radcliffe Power Station, M&P Packaging Factory, the London bus workers, who had a massive show of strength last Friday, picket lines of hundreds, and a real confidence that they can win, mainly because of the Olympics, and they know that they've got the mayor and the bus companies over a barrel, because what would happen to Johnson if the buses don't run the first week of the Olympics. But the disputes across the length and breadth of the working class, what we still need to do is draw that into a coordinated and organised fight back. We've started to raise in the Socialist Party and the National Shop Stewards Network the idea of a one-day general strike, where those organised workplaces that have been in dispute could coordinate their days of strike action in a show of strength of the working class, try and draw in the unorganised workers, small business and so on. So the final point I'll make is that we haven't, what became decisive in Greece, so the struggle and the process still has to play out, is that it was when the struggle which became blocked on the industrial front, 16 general strikes that didn't stop austerity, but when the Greek working class simultaneously turned to the electoral front as well and began the process of searching for a political alternative, partly reflected in the growth of Syriza. It was when the ruling class in Europe and Greece and across the world started to actually talk about a full challenge to their system, and began to ratchet up the attack on left wing, on socialist ideas in particular. We think in Britain that the Socialist Party is well placed. We've mentioned the National Shop Stewards Network. Matt's talked about the Trade Unionists and Socialist Coalition, and we think we're laying the foundations which, when the working class in Britain begins to move in a much more large-scale and decisive way, that we think that we have a lot of the ideas that they will turn to. We'll learn from the movement as well, but we think that we're in a good position to make sure that when the fight back reaches a high pitch in Britain, that socialist ideas are at the forefront, and that our party is involved in leading those struggles yet to come. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll now open it up to the floor. If anyone's got any questions, would like to ask, comments.